Hello and welcome to PerchPeek Pods, the only place to get long form interviews with some of the world's leading global mobility experts. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Nicky Taylor, Head of Corporate Global Mobility at Nestlé. Nicky, welcome to the podcast. Introduce yourself to the community and tell us how you got involved with the wonderful world of mobility.
Thank you, Paul. Super pleased to be invited onto this prestigious podcast. So thank you for having me. Yes, I'm head of corporate global mobility at Nestlé. The corporate in the title there means we have a kind of headquarters responsibility and role here. We have heads of mobility in some of our big markets as well, but essentially we set the strategy and policy and operational direction for our market teams at Nestlé. Um, I've been in mobility for, I think it's 19 years this year, which makes me feel super old. Uh, I fell into it like I'm sure many of my peers have. I'd been traveling, came back, didn't know what I wanted to do, and all I knew is that I wanted to do something with an international focus and a people focus. Uh, and started off as a relocation consultant with Server on site at Deutsche Bank, which was a great first exposure
Wow.
to global mobility, and then took some other roles from there, and the rest is
Yeah,
history.
that is epic. I mean, two immediate off-topic pieces, but one, I feel like all of the best careers start with I was traveling and didn't know what I want to do. But when you say you fell into it, but it sounds like it was actually a little bit more calculated than some in the sense of you knew you wanted something international, you knew you wanted something with people. I think anyone listening to the podcast would be thinking, yeah, that's mobility for you. Very, very international, lots of people involved. So, you sort of had that as your guiding principle, and then you were looking at, you sort of presumably then found out that mobility was an industry and that there were some jobs at Server and went from there.
Exactly. I didn't even know there was an industry about the whole
Yeah.
thing, and I think, you kind of step into it and you see that there's so many layers and depth and width and breadth to the whole thing. It's a whole kind of secret world that you step into, and then some people wanna step back out of that secret world, but I've enjoyed being in it and think it's
Yeah.
a place to play.
Yeah, it is. And I think certainly if you like sort of being international and and working with people, it is a good spot, and yeah, that's pretty cool. So that was the start of your career. So the vendor side of things. Now you're in a role that spans however many countries. I mean, ballpark, how many countries are you sort of
We've got
responsible
something
for?
like 80 home countries and 85 host countries.
Wow. So
So a
that's
pretty dispersed program. Many of those locations have got 5 or fewer expats in them, so
yeah.
we're pretty scattered about the world.
Yeah, exactly, which I can tell people are thinking 80 plus markets, that's tough. You mentioned there that you are sort of responsible for the strategy and then that sort of cascades out. I think something
Mm.
we often see uh, leaders at companies that maybe aren't as mature as Nestle and they're growing their footprint, worrying about is, okay, should we try and do everything from a centralized point of view, or should we just allow the local entities to basically decide what they want to do if they have an expat or someone relocating there? What's your experience been that? I mean, let's start at the career level, sort of looking at working
Yeah,
with
look,
centralized versus decentralized.
I've worked in both,
Mm,
and I think they've both got their pros and cons, of course. I
yeah,
don't think one necessarily is better than the other. Depends a lot on the fit of the organization from a cultural perspective,
yeah,
but also then, your operating model, how is your tech
mm,
organized? How is your
true,
teams organized? All of that's your vendors, the degree of outsourcing
yeah,
versus instantly. All of that plays a massive role. Um, Certainly at one of my, roles, we had a centralized team and it worked beautifully.
yeah,
It was a smaller program and we outsourced a lot,
yes,
and, depended quite heavily on our local HR teams for support. We were operating out of London at the time. If you've got somebody moving to Nigeria, then you need to really work hand in hand with your partners and your, internal colleagues as well to really
Yes.
make things work. Here at Nestlé, it's been a much more decentralized approach as an organization. We've been pretty decentralized. I like to think it's from the fact that there's different flavors and foods in
Nice.
countries. Some people like their Kit Kat sweeter than others, right?
I like it.
Um,
I like it. Very on
so I
brand.
think historically there's been a lot of autonomy for our
Mhm.
organization at market level. Um, and again, that works very well because you've got real experts in the market. We're quite a
Mm.
pastoral organization, with a lot of support given to our expats on the ground. And so therefore you really need to make sure the right people on the ground, whether that's internal or
Yeah.
external.
Yeah.
But,
Let's
yeah, so one's not
yeah,
better than the other, different, I would.
exactly. It depends. Let's go to that first example you mentioned where you said, okay, small team, centralized, it was working beautifully, quite a lot outsourced and quite a lot of input from local HR because there is always stuff to do at at destination market. In that centralized model, how did you try and get the buy-in from the local HR to kind of adhere to essentially what you were telling them to do from,
Mm.
from the region? Was that a problem? Were they just happy that you had basically decided most stuff and they didn't really have to think about it too much? What was your experience there?
Yeah, I think because we'd outsourced quite a lot, there wasn't too much of a strain on the local market. For
Okay.
sure, you needed their support from an internal perspective for internal matters like the local onboarding and things like that. But because we had a good network of external providers, a lot of the heavy lifting was done from the provider side. Um, Obviously, you get the odd situation where it's not going to plan or there's a bit of dissatisfaction or
Yeah.
whatever, and sometimes that would then cause a little bit of triangulation between,
Mm.
where we were running things centrally, the local office and the provider or the expat, but
Yeah.
but generally it worked pretty well, and I think, it was also a culture where there was a lot of collaborative global teams. So it was quite normal to be working with colleagues in other locations, whether that be on projects or general processes. So there was a lot that was facilitating that
Yes.
approach.
Yes. And I'm going to get really specific here because something we've heard before is, you've got that situation, you're mainly outsourcing, so you've got your vendors and something goes wrong. Ideally, when things are working beautifully, do you want local HR to come to you to manage with the vendors? Were you recommending that they just go straight to the partners themselves and manage any sort of issues directly? Like how did you set things up?
Yeah, look, I think we would expect the local teams to come to us to escalate any
Yeah.
issues. Now, ultimately, we are accountable for global mobility, accountable for the relationships with the vendors,
Yes.
and would really want to take the ownership of addressing any challenges and doing that. And, you've got to, uh, like any good internal facing organization or team, you've got to keep your internal stakeholders happy and take their needs into consideration. So that's not just the needs of the experts, the needs of the HR teams.
Hmm.
And so, an escalation for an HR manager is ultimately not where they should be focusing their time.
Yeah.
So we want that, at least in that model, we'd want that shared
Yeah.
back to us for us to address with the providers or whatever needed to be
Yeah.
happening.
That makes sense. So sort of keeping that sort of ownership clear and then obviously
Absolutely.
tactically. When you said things were working beautifully, I'm sure people were like,
Mm.
what does working beautifully look like in mobility? What do you mean by that? I put you on the spot.
Look, there was a lot of global standardized processes, and
Hmm.
I think we'll come on to that a bit later when we talk about the kind of decentralized approach as well. But there was a lot of standardization,
Yeah.
and I think everybody in mobility will appreciate that there is a degree of localized processes that needs
Yeah.
to come into play. But really, I'd say that they were mostly managed by the vendor
Nice.
in that sense. So it was really kind of a lot of hand-holding, from the vendor, a lot of trust with the vendor. That didn't happen overnight, that
Yeah.
takes some years to build and grow,
Yeah.
develop. But I'm very keen to make sure that my partnerships with vendors are exactly that, a partnership.
I love
Uh,
that. Yeah.
we're a whole ecosystem. You can't, mobility can't happen without all of the other actors, uh,
Yes.
on
Yeah, it's so
stage
true.
and such. You need everybody to be doing their bit. So there's a lot of trust that's needed and a lot of effort, time, energy that goes into really building that trust and that rapport so that you can
Mm.
challenge each other both ways, I think. So,
Yes.
yeah, in
Yeah.
terms of it working beautifully, I'd say it was a lot of standardized processes and great vendor relationships.
I love two beautiful golden nuggets, and definitely you see it when things aren't working well. It is when every new relocation is a giant conflab of what's this person going to get between the hiring manager, the local HR, centralized mobility. It's all a bit messy. You get halfway through, then you're changing
Yeah.
everything. That's definitely not working well, and it's sort of those standardized processes are, or you've got one thing set up for this market, and it,
Yeah.
that you're constantly chopping and changing. So really love that. Talk to me about vendor relationships. That's always a topic that is quite emotive in our industry because you know it, it's different from other industries, right? If people are moving their lives, how did you actually? You spoke about building partnerships. What does that actually mean? Sort of going for lunch with your partners whenever you can, dealing with difficult times, which obviously are like, what does that actually mean when you build that trust with your partners over time?
Look, I think it's about really sharing the bigger picture and going a little bit more holistic into what you've got going on as a challenge. It's very difficult for providers to get under your skin.
Yeah.
And if they can't get under your skin, how can they really support? So I think it's
Mm,
important to take the time and invest in that relationship from a kind of
yeah.
knowledge sharing perspective. You know, it can be as simple as explaining, the context on the local HR structure. It could be talking about what your internal approval process is. It could be super operational stuff, but then it could also be, more high level strategic issues that you're facing as well. How do we manage talent mobility? Whatever it might be. So I think it's really having that open relationship where the provider can understand your challenges because
Yeah.
you guys on the provider side are great at proposing solutions, but
Yeah.
if it's a solution to a problem that you don't really understand, then it's gonna be very difficult to get the 2 to match.
That's
And so I
so
think it's
true.
about really letting your providers understand what your problems are
Yeah.
so that they can then, come up with
Exactly.
something that's gonna work. Because otherwise you just get frustrated. It's, "Oh, here's another suggestion that we just
Yeah.
can't implement."
Exactly,
Um,
and it could be something like, why don't we try and standardize this in this market? That might seem sensible from a provider side, but you just know internally, like the dynamics are
it's just not gonna
actually
work.
we bought that company 5 years ago. They've never really been properly, integrated. It's just not going to work
Yeah.
exactly. So, but yeah, they're not mind readers. The
No,
providers. So letting
exactly.
them in on things is such great
Yeah,
advice.
I think there's that side of it, but also then that, that willingness to grow and evolve the relationship together, to try new things together, and, test things and have that begin that
Mm,
relationship where you're able to create that space to say, "Hey, I wanna try this. Would you be open to that?" But also for the provider to challenge you back as well and to be able to say, "You know what? That's such a bad idea. Don't do that," or "We can do that, but it's gonna come at this risk, this cost," whatever it might be. So I think it's really open relationship, and once you've got that, I think it becomes a natural synergy rather th an everybody says it, but an extension of your team rather than just, a client-supplier kind of cold
yeah.
relationship on either side.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we can both think of situations where those partnerships have been working beautifully and those partnerships haven't been working beautifully. And it is so
Absolutely.
important to just be,
Yeah.
I think, both being open with your partners, but also we always say try to be open back and, as you say, challenge when something is a bad idea. You
Yeah.
you have the luxury of seeing things all over the world. You don't just need to roll over for
No,
whatever
and there's
clients say.
nothing worse than a provider overpromising and then not being able to deliver.
Exactly. It's like, yeah,
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 just be honest with
definitely.
me, it's okay. I've got
Exactly.
broad shoulders, we'll we'll
Yeah.
we'll do
I,
this together, we'll find a
I,
way forward.
exactly.
Tell
Because
me
there's
there's
nearly
bird noise, it's alright.
exactly. There's always more so you think, but so you don't need to always take the first one. Let's move on to the
Mm.
other side of the question then. So you're in 80, 80 plus home and host markets, decentralized. Firstly, let's sort of what does that really mean? You're setting the policy, but like things are, vendors and local flavors more decided by region, by specific market. What do you mean by decentralized?
Yeah, so we, from a global mobility perspective at least, we've got global policies.
Yeah,
They are somewhat open to a little bit of interpretation
yeah.
in different
Some wiggle
places,
room.
and that's where our markets have really appreciated that flexibility. So that's been a theme for many, many years is having the markets do things that suit them. That includes vendor relationships and some of the way, allowances are set. For example, we provide guidance to the markets, but we don't insist they do it a certain way
Yes.
within some allowances at least. Um, so it's really about having that kind of flexibility to make sure that local preferences, local compliance obligations, we're not going to tell every market to pay housing through payroll because it might be beneficial to do it a different way. It's those
Yeah,
kind of
those types of things make
flexibilities that
sense.
we've really got in the policy, and that's what our markets have been used to for a very long time.
Yeah,
Um, the challenges then come is when you start to try to centralize some of your processes, and ways of working when you've got market specific ways of doing things to take into consideration. Now, if we operated in 7 offices around the world, it's probably okay to cater to those
yeah.
7. With 80 plus, it does become quite a challenge, and I'd say that we've probably got, I don't know, 30% global, 70% local in terms of
Okay.
our ways of working. So
Yeah.
that's something we're trying to work through at the moment in terms of centralizing, but also, standardizing some of that stuff as well.
Yes, I love that. And so many questions because, as you say, it's normally a historical sort of situation that had been decentralized. It's much more
Mm.
common to see it go from decentralized to centralized, and then vice versa. Typically, but always challenges in that process. Are you looking at it and trying to evaluate? Okay, here are some good bits to try and sort of do consistently across, you know, all markets or as many markets as possible. Here are some bits that we're happy to leave with fully decentralized and sort of owned by local HR, or are you just looking at it as we're trying to get as much as possible being centralized?
Probably the former, I'd say. We're looking for where the quick wins and the opportunities are, where there's a bit of a wave, we'll ride it. As a group, there is a shift to leveraging our shared service, our internal shared service organization much
Yeah,
more. So it's not just for global mobility.
nice.
And I think that really helps drive forward that change. It's not just our team saying, hey, can we lift this to a shared service
Yeah,
center? It's, really a group direction to do
yeah,
that.
which is helpful.
Um, Absolutely, and we've got some absolutely fantastic people in our shared service centres as
Nice.
well. We're really seeing a shift away from transactional or purely transactional activities to much more consultative or value add activity, which makes it, a much stronger proposition as well.
Yeah, well, and tell us about tell us a little about that because I feel like people get the knock on the door saying, "Oh, we're moving toward more of a shared services model," and there's always a little bit of panic, I think, understandably, but it sounds like you've had some positive experiences with getting that initial transactional work transferred and then actually making making the transition to actually, being a little bit beyond transactional. What were some of the lessons learned in getting to where you are today, which sounds pretty good, truthfully?
Yeah, look, I think, we're still on a journey.
Yeah,
We're by no means complete on that, but we're
it's not the
still
finished
in the
article.
journey, I would say.
Yeah,
But, I think it goes back to that whole kind of partnership piece as well. All of your stakeholders, all of your, other parties that are supporting, including shared service, you have to treat them as a partnership. You really need to make sure you're on the same page. There's obviously different dynamics at play. We've got a hub. That hub sits as part of HR services. HR services has got its agenda as well as, supporting the services that they support. So you've got to make sure there's a lot of alignment there in terms of the way forward and priorities and things like that. But definitely, we've seen a huge leap and bound in terms of the competence, the profiles that we're seeing in shared services, and we've really got a lot of confidence in their ability to expand and grow as we identified more and more activity to shift to them.
Yeah, yeah, and then actually
So yeah,
once you
it's
start
an
getting it
interesting
working
time.
well, you're like, there's, you know, almost more and more work that you can, which frees you up to and your team up to be a bit
Absolutely,
more strategic.
absolutely, yeah,
The and then tell me one other thing. You mentioned you've obviously got all of these, different, offices around the world. You mentioned quite a few of them often have fewer than 5 moves a year, or certainly fewer than 5 expats, which I think is quite familiar even when you have fewer markets. There's always 1 or 2 markets that
yeah.
just get a couple, and they can often end up being some of the biggest headaches because it's sort of a bit more ad hoc. What have you seen working well for those markets where they have, not as much consistent volume and it is a little bit more of a case by case basis that they get the relocations?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the markets that have those expat positions.
Mm,
Those positions are usually expat positions. So it
yeah,
could be that in one particular country, those 3, 4, 5 positions are always expat.
yeah.
So there's a kind of rotation, if you like, of
Nice,
of,
nice,
of the
nice. So it's sort of
people
steady.
in those locations. And we've got a long-standing community of global mobility professionals globally. So many of them are very, very experienced and very well versed in how to manage those situations. And because, you know, unlike some of the bigger locations where you've got hundreds of people coming through, it can be a bit more difficult to give a real hand-holding approach, but in some of these more remote locations or unusual locations or not quite as
That's true.
attractive locations,
Yeah,
there's a little bit more hand-holding and, on the ground support there, so
yeah,
that tends to work very well.
yeah. Sort of actually, it's almost easier to justify the like sort of extra bells and whistles because they're a little bit rarer, and like it's sort of it's
Yeah,
easy.
and they're often very senior roles and,
Exactly,
they
exactly.
need
Which
a little bit more
yeah,
of a white glove
yeah,
touch or human touch.
exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
What's been the most surprising thing about operating mobility across so many markets?
I think the real kind of we talk about decentralization um, at Nestlé, and I mean I've been here nearly 8 years now, so it's changed a lot. But um, the decentralization isn't even just at country level. Sometimes it's at city or site level. So one of my first activities when I joined all that time ago was to consolidate some of the relocation activities across Switzerland. Even within Switzerland, we've got several different sites,
Wow.
factories,
Yeah.
production centers or research centers, research sites. They had different relocation processes, different providers, even some of those sites. So that extent of decentralization was a
Oh,
real
wow.
surprise,
Yeah.
actually.
You sort of thought, well, this is going to be challenging because of our global footprint. And then you're like, I wasn't expected to have 10 within Switzerland alone. That's kind of hectic.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is true.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I
that
think there's
is.
less of that now, but
Yes.
just really kind of understanding how culturally that decentralization has been very important to us as an organization. But then how do you then bring that together when you want to optimize your ways of working,
Yeah.
leverage the economies of scale and all of that stuff is a
Yes,
nice
exactly.
challenge.
It's a nice challenge because, as you say, it's like it's nice to have that local flavor, local innovation, local, yeah, even outside of mobility. But then it is also, as you say, yeah, missing economies of scales, repeating processes, not learning from best practices sometimes. So it's sort of it sounds like a big role, but that's
Yeah.
but by the by. I mean,
Never
and we're
dull, never dull.
never a dull day, which I think anyone could easily imagine. I think what do you see the future looking like? And this can be outside of Nestle, but like, in your state, you kind of have, you're not going to be opening up a lot of new entities. There's not many places left to go, which is often a big driver of new mobility, new projects out
Mhm.
there, etc. Like it's quite a mature program,
Yeah.
so to speak. So you can sort of streamline things internally. But where are you seeing the sort of future of mobility once companies sort of reach maturity in their programs? It's working well, things are
Yeah.
where they are.
It's a really interesting question. I think, obviously, COVID shifted a lot in terms of work styles, work modes, and the desire for mobility. I think is probably a little bit um, unstable. I think obviously at the time, before COVID, people thought an international career experience was going to be amazing and accelerate their all of that stuff. COVID happened, and I think there was a lot of reticence to be away from loved ones, understandably. And since then, I'm not sure the world has really found its feet on where it sits in terms of, what is the appetite for mobility.
Mm,
We do our own kind of monitoring of that internally
yeah,
um, at Nestle, but I think what I generally see is a shift away from a mature program anyway, a shift away from pure business led mobility and maybe slightly more development focused mobility. So how can you get somebody to, develop the right skills and knowledge? Is it really rather about them gaining that rather than imparting that?
yeah,
I think that's
interesting.
probably the shift that I see. As I mentioned, we've got key roles that will always be held by expats. They're often very senior roles, and they'll always be on somebody's development plan or subject to being a mobility role. So yes, you could argue that's a business need and that's a strategic role and all of that stuff. But I think what we've got bubbling more is really this need to give probably shorter term
Mm,
experiences to younger employees. All of the research says that younger employees are more mobile. You
yeah,
start having kids and all of that stuff, and your mobility is impacted there. So I think it's about the development side.
yeah,
Um, I think it's about more purposeful
yeah,
mobility, really being more focused on the investments that are being made.
mm,
I think it's probably a focus less on the type or policy name that you're given
yeah,
and more about personalization, about how do we make the structure of a move match what an employee needs versus what the business needs versus the cost side of things. So I think there'll be a
yes,
little bit more um, um, variety maybe in terms of the
yes,
way moves are done, less
yeah,
pigeonholing long term, short term. It's
exactly.
more about
Yeah,
kind of
more
getting
right.
rid of that and saying, how do we move
Yes,
somebody? What's the best way to
yeah,
move this person? And we've got this option, we've got
exactly.
that lever to pull.
Yes.
And I
I
do
think,
think personalization will come into it a lot.
yeah, and I guess if I was to challenge you on that, because I completely agree that um, it's we're seeing more and more sort of development, to some extent, almost people that want to move, right, and the company is enabling it to help them get new skills, etc. But I think inevitably, when that is the case, the uh, almost the like business desire typically to spend as much as you would do for a senior expat heading up a local entity or a local branch, whatever, isn't as high. So
Mm.
cost pressures are typically much higher. How do you marry the sort of cost pressure that comes with slightly more developmental
Yeah.
sort of
Mm.
moves with personalization? Because if someone says, "Hey, actually, I'm not going to do it unless you pay for my housing and schooling," and then the business like that makes it and equalize my tax, and then business like that makes it really expensive for us. Like, how do you
Yeah.
think about that trade off?
I don't know. I think if
Yeah,
you can if you can crack that nut, cool, you'll be a
yeah,
multi-millionaire, I'm sure. But
yeah. True,
I
true, true.
think the definitely the availability of local talent is much stronger nowadays than it has been in the
Yes.
past.
Yeah,
There's less of a need to depend on, quite frankly, the white male to go in from
yeah,
Western or the US and, rescue things or save the day. That's just not the story anymore. So, as I say, I'm not sure, mobility is generally has really found its feet on what the real kind of purpose is. And I think it's a little less clear these
Yeah.
days. Why? Because, you don't have to go abroad to work in a global team. You can do that from
No.
your desk at home. You know,
Yeah.
you've got the remote work setups, you've got virtual assignments, you've got
Yeah.
commuters, so many different more work styles now. And I think mobility has to look at all of that in its entirety rather than just
Mm.
saying what we're going to do local to local transfers or we're going to do long-term assignments. And I think it
Yes.
has to be about how do you optimize the use of a global workforce.
Yes, I love that, and
It's
it's
probably less about the physical move in the end,
yeah,
ironically.
yeah, exactly. Certainly the the bread and butter of basically the whole industry, which, as you said, is like white male running in to save things, often with their family, 3, 5 years, whatever it might
Yeah.
be. Everything gets shipped out there, housing, schooling, on to the next one. That's like been the sort of building block of pretty much the entire
Mm.
mobility. That is probably not going to be as common. But there's this other side of it, which is kind of scary in some ways, like the traditional mobility. But as you say, it sort of feels like everyone wants to live and work abroad and or have these international experiences, but it's just like there's many more ways that can
More
happen now
options.
than
Yeah.
just a long-term assignment. And but that is for mobility. How does that? What is mobility's role in that? I think is like
Yeah,
the
exactly. And as we
interesting
say,
question.
how do you marry that up with the cost versus the investment and,
Exactly.
that kind
Yeah.
of thing,
Yeah.
sort of
Because it's
turn there. Mm.
yeah, exactly. Because traditional long-term assignments is are pretty expensive. What do you think this can be anywhere across your career? What do you think the most expensive assignment you've ever seen? Obviously, don't know names or anything.
Ooh, I think it has to be, in the banking sector.
Yeah.
I won't say any more than that, but I think that has to be probably the most,
Yeah. Um,
interesting in terms of some of the requests and some of the
yeah.
costs of those for sure.
Yeah. And it's sort of when yeah, the fees could start getting, well, just the cost, not even really fees, it's just like the overall cost
Well,
can
and
end up.
when you're doing exceptions to manage a private jet being transported, it's a very different
Ah!
beast
So,
to then,
yeah, you're sort of
can
like,
can
oh,
I book my
exactly.
VW Golf?
I know. And you're like, oh, weirdly, I didn't have that in the cost estimate, the private jet move. So, like, they're like, why is this more
Exactly.
expensive? So, yeah, that's, yeah,
Yeah.
stories for another day. Sticking on the topic of,
Mm.
sort of the future, I mean, that was, I think, beautifully put in terms of like it's changing. There could be cause for optimism because it feels like it's more important than ever to have like a global workforce, and it's just not
Mm.
quite sure how that shakes out for mobility. As
Yeah.
the are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you sort of somewhere in between for just for like mobility as an industry?
I think I'm optimistic. Generally an
Nice.
optimistic person anyway, but I would
That's
say
good.
that I'm
Yeah.
optimistic about this because I think it will drive, as I say, more purposeful mobility.
Mm,
And that's, I think, where you really see the good things happen and where, as a function, you feel that you're really enabling the business. It's about understanding what talent or business challenges are on the table and what can you as an HR function, how can you support that?
yeah.
What different tools do you pull out of your toolkit to support that?
Yeah.
So is it about retention? Is it about development? Is it about something else? What are the different drivers of the challenge that you've got? And is
Yeah.
mobility one of those tools that you can pull out of your box of um,
Exactly. And
different equipment and apply that to the situation to have a positive
yeah.
outcome. So I think with cost pressure everywhere, we should be doing more targeted global mobility and really, making sure we're moving the right people for the right
Yes.
reason.
Yeah,
Uh,
and with the right costs associated as
yeah,
well, and sort of recognizing that,
absolutely. And I
there's
think that elevates mobility as a function. which is, I think, why I'd feel positive about it, because it really shows what we can do to make those to solve some of those business and talent problems.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I'm cautiously optimistic as well, but I'm far too optimistic a person, so my G probably doesn't count. As you know, Nicky, we have a tradition on the pod where the previous guest leaves a question for the next guest, and you've got a question that nicely flows on from our conversation today. So, and that is, what do you think the impact of AI is going to be specifically within global mobility?
Oh, internally, we're a bit fed up with the AI question.
Yeah, I love
Um,
that. I love
I
that
think
response.
we've had
Why
so
are you fed
much,
up?
particularly last year, there was a whole buzz around AI and what it can
Yeah.
do. And again, I think it's about looking at what challenges you've got and what are the right tools to fix it. Technology for sure will help us speed up and automate the way we do things. Whether that technology solution is AI or a different type of technology, I think the the question. I think it's not what AI can do as a whole, because, I mean, the lists are endless, right? But I
Yeah,
think it's about what
exactly.
challenges do you have and what is the right solution for that? So it's a little bit like what mobility can do for a talent or business challenge. It's like, what are the processes that you struggle with? Where is the time saving needed? I think it will come. Again, I'm not
Mm.
sure I've seen some marvelous examples of it working particularly well. So I'm
I
very
love this.
open-minded, but I'm
I
waiting
love
to
this
see.
example though, but I completely agree with the sort of, it feels like there's a lot of technology looking for a problem to help solve within mobility, specifically right now, rather than, hey, what are the problems and what is the best way to solve this? And I think plus, made everyone better, faster at responding to emails, faster at organizing things, better at transcribing calls, all of that good stuff that is indisputable. I think within mobility specifically, it's like, what are the things that core problems that mobility used to face? Like, ultimately, it's probably not going to reduce the cost of tax equalizing someone right now. Do you know what I mean? Just like
Yeah,
in
yeah.
a that's like a government policy.
I
It's not going
I
to reduce
think
it.
I think in mobility, it's a lot of it's on the process side. How do you speed
Exactly.
up the biz of working? Um, as we've said, it's a real human-centered, or human-centric, um, topic. So you've got to make sure you keep that balance of the human touch versus the automation there. I think that might be a little bit of a challenge for AI, in the industry. But I think, we had a presentation by one of the consulting firms last year that told us, imagine that you wake up in the morning and your alarm clock knows to send a signal to your shower that puts the shower at the perfect temperature and lays out the
Yeah.
because of the meetings you're going to have that day. And whilst you're in the shower, gives you a debrief of the report and tells you the pertinent points that you need to pick up for your next
Yeah.
meeting. That's wonderful. If it can make
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
day-to-day life easier, great. If from an expat's perspective, it can say, you want to live in that area, not this area, because we know
Yeah.
that people in that area suffer with this or really enjoy that,
Exactly.
then great. I think it will enhance rather than and I think it will be a slow, steady kind of enhancement rather than a all of a sudden something is
Exactly.
done
Pops
massively
out.
differently.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, particularly when at the end of the day, like, relocation is one of the most kind of physical, like, embodiments out there. I can definitely see it massively speeding up things that maybe used to take a few days, whether that be
Yeah.
like communication in particular, and sort of like requests for like, hey, what does this mean from a tax point of view? Can 100% see that
Yes.
being instant rather than, a couple of days to get back to you and, big charge at the end.
Yeah.
I'm quite bullish there,
Yeah,
but
and you see a lot about chatbots, and I'm like, "Oh, just," I never have a good experience with a chatbot myself.
yeah,
So
exactly.
okay, chatbots, but
I th-
come on, let's think bigger than that. I mean, some of our, shipping providers are now doing, the virtual quote,
yeah,
technology where you use your phone and you take a scan
yeah,
of the
yeah.
room and that tells you the volume. I mean, that kind of stuff is really
Eh,
great. Now,
yeah.
is that powered by AI or is that just technology? So
Yeah,
it's
exactly. When it's sort of a hybrid, right? It's like, it's
yeah,
the combination, it's computer vision and then being able to estimate. And that's great. That's something that used to be expensive and time consuming and now can be done instantly. So
Well,
and that's a massive win. So again, like the industry, cautiously optimistic. We definitely speed things up on the process side, but
yeah.
will be interesting to see. So I love that answer, Nikki. We've gone way over time, but I knew that would happen with yourself. So I could keep going all day, but we'll put draw a line on it there. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll save
Thank you for
some for the
having
next
me.
one. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
Great. Thank
Cheers,
you, Paul.
Nikki.
Nice to see
Bye
you.
bye.
Take care. Bye.